Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine. Welcome to this series where we are exploring kindergarten through grade 8. Today we are looking at grade 4 and the 10-year-old child. This is a really important year for the child, and while this might not be my favorite year, I really love grade 3 and I really love grade 5. This year actually has my favorite main lesson block of all the grades. We're going to explore that in a little bit, but let's talk about what's going on with the 10-year-old child in grade 4. I'm going to share a little bit of what might be happening in a classroom setting if your child is going to a brick and mortar school. I'm going to share a little bit about our experience in our homeschooling journey. The first thing is that your student is most likely beyond the tumultuous 9-year change. Now, if you want to know more about the 9-year change, I encourage you to check out the blog post on grade 3, as well as the video that I share on grade 3, and you can find both of those links in the description box below. But to give a very brief recap, grade 3 or age 9 is a very pivotal year in the sense that for the child, they are going from the whole world is one with them and a world where fantasy and reality aren't separated, and they don't really have a past yet. They don't have a solid identity yet. And you will see these changes occur after the 9-year change, whereas prior to that, they might seem like they're individualistic, but post 9-year change, and especially into their 10th and 11th year, you can really see that develop and blossom. And so the 9-year change can be a very disorienting time for a student, very unsettling. Sometimes children might have trouble sleeping, they might have greater anxiety, they might end up having some conflict with their friends and family that they did not have before, and it can be really alarming as a teacher or a parent if you're not quite sure what's happening, to see this child going through this developmental change and not really knowing what's on the other side of it. Well, what's on the other side of it is the 10-year-old child, and it is fabulous. They are finally beyond that 9-year change. They are a lot more settled in their body. They're a lot more confident and curious. And so all of this disruptive time where they did feel a little bit lost in their identity, all of that's coming together for the 10-year-old child. Now, one of my favorite things about the 10-year-old child is this romanticized image that I have in my head of children who are around 10 years old on their bicycles exploring the neighborhood. And I say this because when I was around 10 or 11, I had a paper route and I was going through my neighborhood on my own, on my bike, feeling quite independent, delivering newspapers back when that was a thing children did in like the 1980s. And then collecting, at the time it was $5.25 for a month of receiving home delivery of our local newspaper, and then having that spare change, that spare money to do whatever I wanted to do with it. It wasn't very much, but it was my own. And so there was this great sense of individualistic identity that is still a part of community and family and classroom, but for the first time, we're really at 10 years old defining who we are. It is a really beautiful thing to see. Now, along with that new identity comes some introspection and reflection that will continue to deepen as children go through puberty and beyond. But for the first time, children are identifying themselves as something. And so this was a time when I remember being in school and thinking that I wanted to be the smart one. Like, I wanted to get good grades. Like, that was going to be who I was. Like, it was really important for me to get good grades at the time. And I remember that there were other students, and this is in reflection. Like, at the time, you can see it, but you don't, as a child, and even as an adult, if you're not aware of these developmental changes, you might not be aware of what's happening, and you might be like, oh, my student is doing so well, or my child is doing so well, and really it's part of like this new identity, this new development. At the same time, you might find some children who are like the funny child in the class, the funny kid in class, and that's become their identity. With the 10-year-old, you might find that there's this new humor. Maybe it's a little mischievous, maybe it's a little bit like pranks, that's new for the 10-year-old child. Like they're starting to explore that and kind of like it a little bit. So there's a little bit of mischief, a little bit of independence, and a little bit of pushback on the boundaries. So up until this point, the 9-year-old child and for all the years before, children really were one with the world. And if you think back to being a new parent, especially as a mother with a new infant, that infant has no concept of time to begin with and has no concept of self. The infant is one with the mother. Like there is no separation. And through growth and maturity in life and development, that child begins to understand that there is a limit to their body. There's a boundary to their body that's separate from the boundary of other people. And so they learn to recognize or understand that they are a person separate. But for up until 9, even though an 8-year-old child understands that there's a separation in their physical body from someone else, there is still the cognitive understanding is that they are one with the world. It's just like they're merged together with their surroundings. After the 9-year change, there is a clear understanding that there is a separateness between that person, that individual, and the rest of the world. So by the age of 10, you're looking at children who can clearly identify, like, this is the great big world, and here I am, and what am I going to do, and how am I going to work within this world? So there's usually a great amount of curiosity. And so what you might find is that children might be maybe a little bit pushing the boundaries of what they're capable of doing or what they maybe couldn't do before. So maybe they want to stay up a little bit later. Maybe they want to explore their neighborhood on their bikes with their friends a little bit later, a little bit farther. And granted, I grew up in a time where it was normal for young children to be in the neighborhood, go to the park, be on their bikes and do those things. And I know that with my children and with as we have moved forward generation after generation, that kind of childlike freedom has kind of come in a little bit, and there's a little bit more safety awareness and a more structured play and more structured time, so that we don't have these long periods of time after school where children are just out and about playing with their friends until dusk. And so what we have instead are, say, sports that are curated, or play dates, or extracurricular activities. And so that opportunity for that kind of exploration has gotten a little bit shrunken down a little bit. And so for those environments, for those neighborhoods, for those families where that still exists, you're going to find that that children are feeling very capable to do these things that for them, it is completely safe and they can completely do it. And then for the adults around them, especially as the adults get much older, because I know that I was quite a different parent in my early 20s than I am every decade following that for the parents, there may be a little bit of hesitation to that safety, but this is the time when those children are looking to push those boundaries, to explore that new freedom, and to really test their abilities to be independent and capable in this new world. So what kind of lessons might you expect for this 10-year-old child in grade 4? My absolute favorite main lesson block for grade 4 is the one on man and animals, the zoology block. And so I'm going to begin there. One of the things that I really love about this is that you're seeing this from a spiritual perspective rather than a scientific perspective. And so in the Waldorf pedagogy, science is really reserved for middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and of course high school and beyond. But in grade 4 and grade 5, we have two main lesson blocks, the zoology block, which is the man and animal block. And in grade 5, you have botany. And in some cases, you might start with astronomy and it moves into mineralogy as well. But you have these two main lesson blocks in the life sciences that are this soft transition into the hard sciences or the sciences of middle school, which are going to be mineralogy. Earth science is saved for grade 9. And so there is a subtle difference between mineralogy and earth science. And so I hope that you'll come back for that grade 6 video where I explain the differences between them and why one is reserved for later, whereas mineralogy is done in middle school. Grade 4 and 5 are transition years for the sciences and the history main lesson blocks. So whereas there's a lot more science in middle school because chemistry will be for at least 2 years, physics is for 3 years, anatomy, and there's a hygiene block, that's for 2 years. And so these main lesson blocks are going to be central to the education in middle school as well as recorded history, modern history. And so in grade 4 and 5, you're having this transition from mythology and ancient history into recorded history and the hard sciences. And then in the early years, of course, you have all of the skill buildings of reading, writing, and arithmetic. So in grade 4, you have the zoology block, which is the man and animal block. So this is the first, in my opinion, more science-based main lesson block. Prior to this, there were a lot of nature stories. What I love about this main lesson block is its spiritual significance. So the child now at 10 years old is finding that they can work within this world. They are here. They are a person, and they are beginning to identify themselves, like who they are, what can they do. And the man and animal block actually begins with man, and it begins with the whole entire form of the human being. And this is something that you're going to see time and again in the Waldorf pedagogy, is beginning with the whole, then moving to the parts. And it's something that's so prevalent in all of the main lesson blocks. Sometimes we forget to actually identify this very beautiful and significant teaching tool. And so when we're looking at the whole, we're looking at the whole human being first before we start to examine the animal kingdom. And what we see about the human being in its form is that you have the head, you have the trunk, and then you have your limbs. And what's unique about the human being versus animals is that our limbs, our legs, are used to carry our bodies, but our bodies are upright, and that's also unique to much of the animal kingdom. And yes, there may be some animals that can be upright, but the way that their spines are developed and the way that they are created, they are different than humans, very clearly different from humans. And so we're really looking at this form of the human being where the legs are used to carry this form, carry the human being to move. We can move from place to place, but our arms, these limbs, are left free. And what are they free to do? And the lesson, at least the curriculum that we follow, the lesson says, well, our arms are free to do for others, to give charity, to help others. And I thought that was the most beautiful representation of the human being. Of course, there are many differences in the human being versus the animal kingdom, but this particular difference was such a beautiful way to bring a spiritual aspect to this man and animal block, to zoology, which I've not seen any other place. And if there are other curricula out there that can bring about such a beautiful way of explaining the difference between man and animal, please let me know, because I'm always blown away by how beautifully presented this particular main lesson block is. And it's very quick and it's very subtle. It is the first lesson before you quickly move into looking at the animal kingdom. And the way that the animal kingdom is divided is not scientific. It is more of a soul encounter, as the Waldorf pedagogy will explain, more of a soul encounter for the child and the animal kingdom. Once the first lesson of the zoology block is presented, now we can move into the different categories of animals. Now, there are a few different ways that these lessons are presented. The first is to look at the 3 parts of the human, the head, the trunk, and the limbs, and divide certain animals into those categories. So we begin with the head animals, and these are ones where you can imagine like the entirety of that animal is contained in the head. So we're looking at octopus and cuttlefish, for instance, as those first lessons. Then we move into trunk animals and we explore different kinds of fish. And this gives you some really great opportunities to do lessons that are representative of your personal or your children's interests, or maybe someplace that's environmentally significant. And so you might choose different animals that are significant for you depending on your interest or where you live. Next, we're going to move into the limb animals. And are there really any limb animals? Well, there aren't really any limb animals, but we can start to explore the limbs of animals. So animal tracks, different kinds of limbs like paws or wings. And this is also another great opportunity to go into the field and to explore in your own environment some of the animals, like the animal tracks that might be in your regional parks or in your neighborhood. So those kinds of categories are definitely not scientific categories, but the next set of categories also is not going to be a scientific set of categories. In fact, it's more of probably more unique to the Waldorf pedagogy when we're looking at the threefold aspect of the human being in relation to the animal kingdom. And once again, the animal kingdom in its totality is a representation of the human being. And there are different archetypal animals that are represented in a way to bring about similarities within the human being. So the human being in its threefoldness will have thinking, feeling, and willing. And these three categories have been at the root of many of the lessons and many of the main lesson blocks from the time the children were young. We're going to explore that again here in the zoology block when we are comparing different kinds of animals. So the three animals that are chosen to really signify not just these different aspects of the human being, but others as well, are the eagle, the bull, and the lion. And so the eagle we see has very refined sense of sight. So that organ is especially refined. It's usually associated to the nervous system and to the aspect of thinking. Next, we have the cow or the bull, and we can see that in comparison to the eagle, this animal maybe lives a little bit more of a dreamlike existence where the majority of the time is spent digesting food. So we can really see this as a trunk animal, an animal that really works on the digestion. We think of it as a will animal, like the will forces. And what's really curious is the will forces aren't just in the things that we do, but it's also in our dreams and our wishes and our resolutions as well. We do use the live education Waldorf curriculum for the most part. Now, oftentimes we will depart and do our own main lesson blocks or our own unit studies. But if you want more information on what the curriculum is about, you can also find links in the description box below, as well as on the blog post that accompanies this video, where you can find a lot more video tutorials on the grade 4 experience. And so in looking at these different kinds of animals related to these different senses, we're also going to look at the lion, and the lion is generally referred to as the feeling or associated to the rhythmic system. Now, while these lessons are still going to be presented for the student, then we're not going to go into this kind of depth. This is a little bit more for the teacher to understand the reasons why these lessons are being presented in this way for the grade 4 student. So you have a great opportunity to explore many different animals because so many of them will be within these different categories. And another great way in order to bring these lessons to life is to include some poems or some verses that the children can memorize. Of course, writing and illustrating within the main lesson block. And one of my favorite things to do is always go out into the field and to observe these animals, whatever ones are available for you. We can at least find a few mammals and maybe some birds that can be observed, or maybe even some tracks if you're really observant and you go maybe for us after it's rained a little bit, and maybe we can see tracks like in the mud, or if you live in a place that snows and it's winter time, you could see tracks in the snow. And so those are really great. Or if you're by the beach, you can see some tracks, that maybe some bird tracks in the wet sand. And so those are other opportunities to really bring connection to the main lesson block. Okay, so that's one of my favorite main lesson blocks of all time because it brings in this really beautiful spiritual aspect of the human being. And really the part that interests me the most out of this entire main lesson block is what you can do to give back to the world, to give back to family, to give back to community, what kind of charitable acts you can do, because you have these limbs that are free to do that because they are not necessary to move your body or to hold your body. So I really love that aspect. Now, when we first approached this particular main lesson block, I decided to include stories that were relevant for us, for our cultural and religious background. And I found that it was really difficult to fit them in the same way that this main lesson block had arranged the lessons. And so oftentimes you might find that you might have completely different lessons if you want to explore, like say the animals of the Quran, for instance, then those lessons would be entirely different from the purpose of doing a zoology block presented in this manner according to the Waldorf pedagogy. So what else can you expect in grade 4? Grade 4 is the introduction of fractions, and this is a really big milestone in math to be talking about fractions. Now again, we're starting with the whole and going to the parts. And so with fractions, while children will intuitively understand fractions, this is the first time we're putting pen to paper or pencil to paper to really understand the math behind fractions. So children probably are familiar with, say, dividing a cookie into 2 pieces so that, both children can have a piece of something that is already whole, or dividing up a pizza, for instance. That's a really great way to see the different slices as being portions, especially if you are the one who gets to actually cut that, especially if it's like a small individual size pizza that you can really see, like we're going to cut it in half and then we're going to cut it in half again to make quarters. And children at this age, especially 10 years old, have a very keen intuition and a keen sense of justice, fairness. And so if you are trying to divide that pizza or that cookie and it's not exactly cut in half, that child is going to say something about it for the most part. And so in this, now we're looking at exactness in math when it comes to fractions. And math has always been an exact science or an exact subject area. But now we're looking at it from the perspective of starting with the whole, this whole number. Now, we've done division before. We've taken 10 or 12 and divided it by 2 or divided 12 by 3. We've done that before, but those have been multiple numbers. Now we're just going to take 1. Can 1 really be something smaller than 1? 1 has always been whole. And it's important that we kept 1 whole up until the 9-year change. But post 9-year change, it's very exciting for children to be able to see that even things that are whole in 1 can be divided up into smaller parts. So now we have the introduction of fractions, eventually decimals and percents. And of course, the ultimate goal is to be able to do all 4 mathematical operations with fractions and decimals. So that would be addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Now I found that in introducing fractions for my kids in particular, it went over much easier if we did a lot more living math for many years prior to actually putting pen to paper. And I say pen to paper, but pencil to paper, just really doing like the work associated to the math. And so I like using games, especially in order to practice those math facts, so just get familiar with them. There are a couple of games that we especially like. And there's a game that's similar to Scrabble called Equate that also uses numbers and fractions in order to create equations. That has been a lot of joy for our family. And so practicing this math ahead of actually doing the math as worksheets and doing the math as lessons is the only way, in my opinion, that my kids or students in general can really understand it. If you go directly to the worksheet or directly to the lesson without having had a lived experience with math, I feel like they may be able to get amazing grades and do very well with the math, but when it comes to actual practical application of that math, it really falls apart. And so I would prioritize the practical application whenever possible, because when it finally comes time to write that down, it's going to come much more easily and much more organically. So what are some of the things that you can do that can help just in living math, especially when it comes to fractions. One of my favorite ways to do this is heading to the kitchen and pulling out a recipe and starting to work through it. Now, a lot of times when we're doing a recipe that we are actually following a recipe for, it might be to make a batch of cookies. And in that case, it's a great opportunity to cut that recipe in half or in quarters. So once you get familiar with the fractions, because in baking, it's usually you're going to have fractions within like the amount of flour you need or the amount of butter you need, for instance. You're going to have a fraction, but now we're going to take it up a notch and we're going to take that entire recipe and we're going to cut it in half. And this is my favorite way to do some practical fractions math and have a really delicious dessert in the end. It really makes it worth it. Another way to include some living math is by building anything. So it could be really simple and you could just take a bunch of cardboard boxes and figure out how to build a very small, simple structure, or you can invite the children into some of your home DIY projects and begin to have that familiarity with measurement, which was already introduced in the previous year, but now we're looking at portions of a yard or a foot or a meter. And so we're starting to look at portions, which are fractions. And this is another great way to bring living math to the conversation, to life itself. And a lot of times we might think that, well, the children aren't going to understand it, or maybe it's not relevant for them at the moment, but really these are the kinds of lessons and the kinds of experiences that don't just bring math to life, but also make it relevant. Some of the other subjects in grade 4 are Norse mythology. You might have Beowulf as well. What I like about Norse mythology, which I have taken the idea of Norse mythology and the reasons why those particular lessons are delivered in grade 4, and have actually found other lessons that are more culturally and religiously appropriate for us in our family. But for grade 4, for that student who has now come out of that 9-year change and they finally descended, that there's a sense of descending into this planet, into this world, and living within it, and recognizing that you are apart from it. Like there is this big, vast world, and now you are here. What are you going to do here? This is paramount, very similar to the sentiments within Norse mythology. So you have Thor, who's been banished from Asgard and now is on Earth, and he's looking for his hammer. And then, of course, all of the stories that go along with Norse mythology, especially with Loki, who is quite mischievous. And so you're seeing that mirror of this humoristic, mischievous kind of character, which you're seeing the 10-year-old child also exploring that mischievous side to his or her own humor and those little pranks that they might do. And then you're seeing this, in a sense, this loss of paradise moment where there was this existence prior to the 9-year change where children were living in what I will describe as like this blissful environment that's one with everything, that there is no time yet. There is no self-reflection the same way that it comes post 9-year change. And of course, that continues to happen, especially through puberty, where children, as they move into adulthood, have even greater self-reflection. And so you have this period of time where it's almost paradise-like for children. And now it's like this, I don't want to say a harsh reality of living life, but there are some aspects of it that can be difficult for children. Time now is an element, a quality of their life. It seems like it's going very quickly. And so, and in paradise, you can imagine that the time is eternal. And now on planet, like there is the cycles of the day and the night, and time just moves forward. I remember when my children were younger, before the 9-year change, everything that was in the past was yesterday. It didn't matter whether it was literally yesterday or 6 weeks earlier or a year before. There was only just this concept of like, it's already past, it's yesterday, but there is no real understanding of that time. Versus post 9-year change, and definitely by the time children are 10, there's a greater understanding of like a schedule and the past and of course the future. So for that, these stories of Thor and this being banished from paradise, the stories that I chose to tell are ones that reflect our religious creation story, and that would be Adam and Eve, or Adam and Hawa, and that story, which actually is quite different from other religions who do have some resemblance and some similarities. The story of Adam and Hawa is one of time in paradise and then a time that they are on earth. And it's that in-between time, that shift from paradise to earth, that is extremely different from the Islamic perspective than in other religions. And so if you want more details about that, I encourage you to check out the grade 4 blog post on my website at pepperandpine.com. That link, of course, is in the description box below if you want to know more about it and the similarities and the differences that you'll see in other religions. I think it's not just subtle, but it's extremely profoundly different in a way that really changes like your entire view of existence. So I encourage you to check it out. Some of the other lessons that you're going to have in grade 4, of course, you continue with the language arts main lesson block, and the stories in Norse mythology and in Beowulf will be the content for those lessons. So for the paragraphs, so now that the child is able to write not just complete sentences, but they're working into writing complete paragraphs. And some of that content will be from the stories that they are listening to in Norse mythology or Beowulf. And so now the children can create main lesson entries that are full paragraphs, maybe compound sentences, and of course have more detailed grammar. And their punctuation, of course, should always be addressed. Like we're not looking at making incomplete sentences or sentences that don't have correct punctuation. We want to make sure that all of that is well in order. So now they have the basics for creating an entire narration, not just 1 or 2 sentences. They can now do a complete thought within a paragraph and have even compound sentences within that paragraph. And now we're just going to be moving into longer and larger narrations as they move into the middle school and upper grades. Specialty classes will continue in handwork, in music, and in foreign language. And there are actually many other lessons as well. There are games, there's the pentathlon in grade 5. There are other lessons that are included throughout the Waldorf experience. A lot of those things we didn't include in our homeschool. Eurythmy is another really big one that I forgot to mention earlier, but you are having these specialty classes throughout the grades, and each year those specialty classes, especially in eurythmy and handwork, actually really support the development of the child. And so those skills that are taught in those specialty classes are going to reflect where the student is at and support that development. Especially in eurythmy, you're going to see new movement forms being introduced, and in handwork, new skills are introduced. In grade 4 handwork, cross stitch is introduced. And in grade 4 eurythmy, students are working with copper rods, and they are doing a lot of movements that require a lot of like, not quite cross body, but sort of like this X formation, especially in cross stitch. That's the exact formation that you're doing. And that is a really important reflection of the development of the student. So this is a really curious thing that even the handwork and the eurythmy are supporting that child with skills and a way to perform those skills in a way that supports that child's development. So a really beautiful way. And so I love including a lot of handwork in our lessons whenever possible. We haven't included eurythmy within the lessons, but if you do learn a few movement exercises that can help within your homeschool, then I highly encourage you to include that. And one of the other things that we love to include that isn't really part of a main lesson block in particular is our mental math or our movement math. And introducing movement math at this age is fabulous. Children love to get up and move around. If you're in a larger group, a larger setting many children, it could be a little bit more disruptive than you're expecting, especially if you're using bean bags or counting sticks or just your hands to clap. But overall, in our homeschool, we included a lot of mental math and movement math, and I found that it was enjoyable for the students. We always ended up smiling or laughing when we were working on math that way. And so I highly encourage you to try it out. And of course, including a lot of math games whenever possible, really rounded out our experiences, especially in our opening activities, to make it highly enjoyable. I hope that you enjoyed this look at the grade 4 10-year-old child. I encourage you to check out the blog post that accompanies this video. You can find that link in the description box below. You'll find more details about the grade 4 10-year-old child, more than I've even mentioned here. So I highly encourage you to check that out. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on my website at pepperandpine.com.